spent the last panel talking about the political realities and difficulties and challenges and obstacles to getting some kind of a grand bargain passed. We now have a panel to discuss the policy substance of what such a bargain might look like. So, again, I'll give brief introductions and then we'll jump into the conversation. Of course, Senator Pete Domenici is with us. He represented New Mexico for 36 years, the longest tenure in the state's history. At various points in his career, he led the Budget Committee, the Energy Committee, various subcommittees, and as Budget Committee Chair, he produced 2 consecutive balanced budgets, the only federal balanced budgets of the last 50 years. He also recently chaired the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force, along with panelists Alice Rivlin, who you may remember from such prestigious roles as our first panel this morning. We have Bill Hoagland with us, to Senator Domenici's right, Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He has decades of federal government service under his belt, most of that as Senate staff. He was Director of Budget and Appropriations in the Office of Majority Leader Bill Frist. He was also many years on the Budget Committee staff, working on major budget legislation, reporting to Senator Domenici. And also on the panel, we have Bob Bixby, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, of course, founded by Senator Rudman, a nonpartisan organization that encourages fiscal responsibility in Washington and helps educate the public about the federal budget and the need to protect our children and future generations from excessive government debt. Welcome to all 4 of you. And as the sole Senate staffer on the panel, I understand Bill Hoagland wanted to begin by making a comment related to Senator Rudman's legacy. So before we dive into the conversation, Bill.
Thank you, Ari. And I should also say that my first real boss in Washington, D.C. was Dr. Alice Rivlin when they established the Congressional Budget Office. So I've got 2 previous bosses to my left and have to be careful of what I say here this morning, that's for sure. As I think the only Senate staffer asked to appear here, former Senate staffer, which I'm very honored to be here, I just want to take that opportunity to say that in those some 25 years that I worked in the United States Senate, that Senator Rudman was one of the most respected and admired senators from the Senate staff's perspective, for those who either worked for him or worked with him. And he scared us at times. He was direct, but he was always supportive if we understood our facts and could present them clearly to him. He had an ability also to attract some wonderful dedicated staff. He referred to them in his book as first-rate staff. So for the young lawyers, students, these names will not mean anything to you, but I just wanted to highlight a few of them who worked for him over those years and really did a great job. Tom Pogar, Jim Carroll, Christine Ciccone, Paul Barbadoro, Paul Jacobson, Marion Phelan, and a close personal friend of mine and Senator Domenici, who worked for Senator Domenici and I, was Bob Stevenson, who was his press secretary and had covered the senator's first campaign here, working for the Foster Daily Democrat in Dover. And then after Senator Rudman left, he came over and worked as our communications director on the Senate Budget Committee with Senator Domenici. I just wanted to make sure that the staff know, or the young students know, that he was really a mentor for all of us, and he was great in terms of dealing with staff on the Hill.
Thank you for that appreciation. And we have a lot of really profound expertise on this panel, moderated by someone with almost none. So my role is going to be to make sure that you all speak English as we get deep into the weeds about what it takes to balance the budget and deal with our country's debts and deficits. So I want to begin with what may be a sort of remedial question. Bob Bixby, explain the difference between cyclical and structural deficits and why this matters.
Well, that is a very good question, and it gets back to some things that were being discussed in the first. A cyclical deficit refers to something that comes and goes with the economy. In other words, it's been a pattern that as the economy declines, revenues drop and spending goes up because you would have fewer people working or earning less money. You would have benefits like food stamps or Medicaid or other support programs going up. And so you have a built-in, they're sometimes called automatic stabilizers because they help the economy, but it does increase the deficit. So those kind of deficits go away again after, right, they will go away when the economy recovers and are not as problematic as a structural deficit, which is a deficit which will persist or even grow larger even with a growing economy. And I'm afraid that structural deficit is, we have both.
Right,
you know, we've had, clearly there are cyclical effects still going on with our current budget deficit, which is why, you know, a lot of the plans, including the ones that we signed on to in Bowles-Simpson, say you shouldn't take drastic action right away because we still have a fragile economy. There's still a bit of a cyclical factor. But we do need to take steps to address the underlying structural deficit, which is the part that's going to grow even larger and is eventually unsustainable.
So when we talk about trillion-dollar deficits for a few years running, which is a factually accurate description of the state of the government right now, who can describe how much of that is cyclical and how much of that is structural? When do the structural deficits really become a problem? Dr. Rivlin, do you want to take this?
Yeah.
Yes, the structural deficits are already a problem. We have cyclical deficits on top of that. But the big pressure on Medicare and Medicaid comes in the 2020s now and 2030s. Now, the baby boom generation is already retiring. But people who retire at 66 are pretty young and healthy by comparison to the rest of the older population. So they aren't putting the kind of pressure on Medicare that they will when they're 85 or 90 if they get that far, because health care spending rises with age. So right now what we have in most projections, if you take the president's or anybody else's, the deficit's coming down because the economy is improving. Not as fast as we would like it to, but it is improving. And so we have a falling deficit for the next several years. But around about 2017, the fall in the cyclical deficit will be overtaken by the rise in the structural deficit caused by the increasing expense associated with the demographic shift, the aging of the population and the retirement of the baby boom generation, and the fact that they will get older and more expensive as they age.
And so, Senator Domenici, as we've seen Congress wrestle with all of these fiscal problems over the last year and reach some sort of, some might say, half-baked compromises to resolve them, to what extent, if any, have those debates addressed the structural problems that Dr. Rivlin described?
Almost not addressing.
Horrific. So, go
Yes.
on.
Well, actually, you've all heard the words. I mean, until you address for our people and for our country, the major one, which is health costs, for the actual budget, it would be more narrow than that. It would be the costs for Medicare. Until you address that and those, you are not addressing the real structural problems of the country. And it just has to be done. The problem, I would say to all of you, is that we always try to solve a problem in America, and we're always kind of late at it, but we generally can feel the problem and know it's here. Fixing this part of our great national fiscal policy is that people can say, it's not here yet. I don't feel it. That's not true. It's not hurting. And a president can get by talking about it and then maybe doing a dance and joining a group and says he's for fixing it, but then not doing anything about it. I tell you, it's the most frustrating thing. When you're my age, you should give up, but I just don't want to yet, because between those Republicans and Democrats that care, we've been able to put together a team, a bipartisan team, and I believe we can say in the past 3 years, this very small think tank called the Bipartisan Policy Center has put together, with Alice agreeing to be co-chair with me, and I'm a Republican, she's a Democrat, and we have led this, and she has been willing to put many hours in, and I have tried. We have shown the American people how a bipartisan group can do all of the tough issues we've got. Healthcare, we'll talk about it in a while, but believe it or not, last Thursday, the Bipartisan Policy Center did agree on a healthcare plan. I won't put it up now, later on we'll tell you about it. And before that, we had put together a bipartisan tax plan. Exciting, terrific stuff. If it got done, we'd have a growth economy. And the last thing we have done is we put together a budget on the expenditure side that is controlled, and we are getting a ratio between the expenditures and the GDP under control. So thank you for the question.
So Bill, to hear Senator Domenici describe it, the answers are obvious. It's just the political challenge of getting it done. Are the answers that obvious?
No, well, with all due, no, it's more complicated than that, I think. I think it's both political. We heard a lot about that in the first panel. But it's also, once you get beyond, let's make a deal. And I'm coming at it from a former staffer's perspective. It's what goes into the deal. It becomes extremely complicated. Healthcare reform is a prime example. We all have the same goal, lower the rate of growth in healthcare. But when you get into the actual structural changes you have to make, this is very complicated. Alice mentioned it in an earlier panel. We're talking about a huge system out there that makes up 18% of our economy, making those kind of changes, which affects 1 out of every $5 spent in this country, is very difficult in terms of structural changes, and it takes time to make those changes and to turn this big ship going forward. Let me just make one quick other observation. Yes, as Dr. Rivlin has said, the deficit is coming down, but I want to emphasize a point that Dave Walker made this morning. Every proposal on the table today, except for the Paul Ryan passed budget resolution in the House, that debt to GDP, that ratio, stays up there. The President's budget, the Senate passed budget, at the end of the decade, still in the 74–75% range. That is historically high. I don't know what the right number is. I personally have decided to tell groups I've given up, in the sense I will never see a balanced budget again in my lifetime. I've given up. But one thing I think we should focus on is lowering that debt to GDP ratio to get it back down to the historical averages have been 40%. I'd be happy to see it get back down to 60%, which was Bo Simpson, Domenici, Rivlin. We have a huge challenge ahead of us, and driven by the demographics and driven by healthcare costs.
Dr. Rivlin?
I think the basic concepts are fairly simple. Bill has spent a lifetime being a wonderful staff worker in the weeds of these problems, and he knows better than anybody else how complex it is to change a law. But I think there is a basic agreement among people who have worked on this problem from a bipartisan point of view on what has to be done, including healthcare, which is exceedingly complicated. But the simple concept is we run a system in this country that's based on paying providers to produce more services. It seems reasonable that if you paid providers to produce more health, you might get a better result. So now it's very complicated to work this out, but I think there is hope that we can move the system with the federal government in the lead, but not, but changing incentives, not dictating this or that, that we can change this.
But paying for better results requires having data about what produces better results.
It does.
And my understanding is we don't yet have that data. Some of that is in Obamacare, is that correct? The data testing?
Well, one of the great leaders on this data collection has been right here in New Hampshire, the Dartmouth project that many of you are familiar with, that shows that there are huge differences between the treatment of Medicare beneficiaries for the same diagnosis.
Right.
Depends whether you live in Miami or you live in Minneapolis.
So that seems like a huge prerequisite problem to fix before we even get to the problem of how do we change the healthcare system to reward outcomes rather than services.
Well, it is, and none of this is going to happen overnight. But the Affordable Care Act did take major steps in the right direction. Created demonstrations of something called accountable care organizations, networks of providers who will share in the savings if they can produce the same outcomes better. And moving faster in that direction is what a lot of people are proposing now.
Could I make just to put the numbers in some sort of context and then bring it to what Alice was saying. When we talk about the structural deficit and the healthcare component of that, just a couple of quick numbers to focus on that hopefully won't be too mind-glazing. But if you just look at federal spending, it's tended to be about 21% of our economy, about 21% of GDP. 40-year average.
For a long time.
Yeah. Revenues, about 18% of GDP, 40-year average. So you might say, well, we tend to run deficits of about 3% of GDP. So for balanced budget advocates like me, that would say maybe that's a little bit too high. But as an economic proposition, if the economy is growing at about 3% of GDP, then the debt is not growing faster than the economy, and you would have a sustainable situation. Now, what's changed? We talked about the cyclical, so let's forget about the cyclical. Let's say that the economy is fully recovered.
And what is a typical growth rate for a healthy economy?
3%.
3%.
And so why are we worried? Well, it's because of the aging of the population and rising healthcare costs and the nature of the budget. 44% of the budget is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Right now, 44% of the federal spending. Now, you have the aging of the population and rising healthcare costs. Obviously, those costs are going to expand as the more people like me begin to qualify for benefits. So, those programs are projected to add, to grow in cost by about 5 to 6% of GDP. So, in other words, that over the next 25 years. So that line that I told you about, the top spending line, would go up from 21% to 26 or 27 or something like that. Obviously, if revenues stay at 18, you get deficits that are now much, much larger and that are totally unsustainable. So the reason that we talk so much about healthcare reform is, and Social Security is part of that too, but that's only the demographic problem, is that something needs to be done not just to accommodate the increased number of beneficiaries, but also the rising healthcare costs. So it's really crucial that we find ways to make sure that healthcare costs aren't growing as fast as they have in the past.
Bill, you wanted to jump in?
Two quick comments and get into the numbers a little bit. But I heard on the earlier panel that 2/3 of the federal budget was uncontrollable. I want to put on the record, I disagree. 100% of the federal budget is controllable by Congress. What that 2/3 was in reference to was the, quote, entitlements or mandatory programs. That's where you have to change. That can be changed by Congress. To Bob's point, I just want to make one other quick observation. The total, Senator Domenici and Dr. Rivlin and Senator Daschle and Senator Frisk, in the report that they released last week, had a grand total over 10 years of reducing, and I want to make it very clear, you wanted clear statements, reducing the rate of growth, not cutting, reducing the rate of growth. Over the next 10 years, the federal government has a commitment on the books today to spend $6.7 trillion for Medicare. They worked for a whole year to come up with the plan that Alice discussed in a very methodical way to reduce that 6.7 by 300 billion. Let me tell you what that means. It means that the rate of growth in Medicare will go from 6.8 to about 6.3, 0.5%. That's how difficult this exercise is.
And I mean, because a lot of it is more people on collecting benefits, and that's not something you can really do anything about,
well, you know,
in any sort of a realistic way.
I mean, not to make the problem even more complicated, but isn't this one of the arguments for immigration reform? Is that if you get 11 million new citizens, you have 11 million more people paying into the coffers that will ultimately fund the baby boomer retirees.
If they do not qualify for the subsidies on the federal exchanges over the next 10 years, which will blow it up too, so it's an issue.
Senator Domenici, did you want to
I think it's important that every chance we get, we tell people who want to be informed how this problem can be dealt with. First of all, the bipartisan group that I talked to you about is a young think tank whose leadership is devoted to getting problems solved. And well over a year ago, we produced a budget that did the job and a tax code reform that did the job. And last Thursday, we produced, after 1 year of effort by the best that we could put together, we produced a health care reform package, which you can get if you write to our think tank and ask for it.
I'm sure it's on the website as well.
People don't write anymore, you know.
Well, that's true. I'm 81, so I talk about these things of writing. I'm not going to ever learn to be as agile as you all. I'll do that from another world, looking down on you as you make progress. But let me suggest to you that since we, in a bipartisan manner, can put this down on paper and grasp it, it's obvious to me that we need this president, if he wants to go down in history, in my opinion, and I would like to go over there and tell him, everything he has done will pale, and he'll get credit for not being a very good president if, in fact, this debt causes a major economic problem during his administration. I don't think there's anything he could do to prevent it if it's coming. It will happen, because we're not doing anything under his leadership to get it done, to get it solved. Now, he has a chance, and I think because we've done this healthcare one in a very different way, we think it's going to attract healthcare leaders from around the country. We're going to be able to tell this president, come on, join forces, get your best people. If you can lead on this one. It's not sure that this will occur the next month or next 6 months, but it's sure that it will occur. The dollar will go phony, inflation will go rampant, our children will look back at us and say, what kind of ants were they? They ate us alive.
We have a question from the audience. What can be done about Paul Krugman? Which I think is meant in jest, but raises a valuable point. Of course, Paul Krugman is a New York Times columnist, economist, who writes that basically this is alarmist thinking, that we do not need to deal with debts and deficits right now. I don't believe we have anyone on the panel who shares that view, but can someone address where that view comes from and what the rebuttal to it is?
I'd like to highlight, and with all the economists in the room, I apologize, and I'm a ag economist, if you can actually believe it, and training. And to Alice, I apologize for this statement, but I recall another Nobel Prize winning economist by the name of Milton Friedman, who used to say that everything we know about economics we teach in 101 economics. After that, we're all making it up. I don't think Paul Krugman has a handle on this. I understand his concern about austerity. and none of us up here, including Alice, you heard her previous presentation, we're not talking about austerity in the near term. I think, quite frankly, the sequester is austerity.
Yeah.
And the first thing I would want to do is any kind of a deal, and by the way, I don't know if we'll get a grand bargain, I'd just be happy for a bargain, is to do away with the sequester, because it really is going to eat into our future investments in education, science, and technology, the things that are necessary to get that economic growth back up into a path of 3% for the future.
Alice.
I think the problem with Paul Krugman is that he can't keep two ideas in his head at once. Now, you'll notice he has a Nobel Prize and I don't.
She deserves one and he doesn't.
But those of us who believe that we need to grow the economy faster right now, and I believe that involves spending more on some job-creating programs and more on things like education and research that will grow the economy in the long run. Those of us who believe that, but also believe that a debt rising faster than the economy can grow is a danger to growth. And we don't know how long it will take to become a danger, but we're pretty sure it will become a danger at some point. So those are two simultaneous ideas. We have to attack both of them. And why Paul can't see that, I cannot figure out.
Well, I'd offer this, that the other thing that Paul Krugman, aside from being a Nobel Prize-winning economist, is he is a columnist for the New York Times, and he's paid to write provocative things that will get people.
Oh, but I think he really believes what he's saying.
Oh, I think he does too.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think this is the overlap of politics and economics, which happens all the time, because people take Krugman's column as their talking points, and they go out and it does make it more difficult when people are getting away from the pure economics of it, because I think, sort of to pick up on something that Bill said, if you can take a set of facts and make almost any political argument that you want to out of it. So I think that the argument is more political here, that the folks that don't want to do anything, that don't like the concept of deficit reduction, are afraid that things that they value most, like the social safety net, are going to be trampled. So it is sort of staking out a position that he's doing in those columns. And I think he probably does know the difference and can keep those things in his head, but he's being a polemicist as well as an economist.
Dr. Rivlin, I understand you have met with people at the White House about this bipartisan proposal. And my question is less, do they give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and more, do they engage with it on a substantive level? Do they say, well, this is nice, we would change this, we might do this differently, we don't approve of this? How do they engage with it?
It depends who you're talking to at the White House. I think the president understands the problem very well and wants to get a solution in during his tenure. Now, many Republicans don't believe that, but I do. And that many of the advisors, substantive advisors around him, Gene Sperling and certainly Jack Lew, others also get it and also want to get to a solution. He's had a bad experience with the Congress in the sense that he feels that if he's for something, the Republicans will be against it automatically and trash it. I think he's got to get over that, and I think he is now, and this meeting with bipartisan groups and having dinner and doing all that is part of it. But yes, they get it substantively, and I think they get it politically. But think about the tactical problem the president had in presenting this budget. Should he take a Democratic stance and then telegraph that he's willing to move to the middle? Mm-hmm. Or should he take a compromise stance? And he did the latter. He did it because he'd already put an offer on the table in his negotiation with Speaker Boehner, and it wouldn't have made sense to back away from that. So he put on the table a budget offer or a budget proposal that is very centrist, that has Democrats very angry as well, and then the Republicans say, well, it's not enough. But I think it is a starting point for a negotiation.
We have a question from the crowd. Is there room within the grand bargain for a means test? Who would like to take that?
No question about it. In fact, the means test, it depends what we're talking about, means testing, but in terms of the Domenici, Rivlin deficit reduction plan plus the health care plan last week, there was means testing as it relates to Part B and Part D premiums, adjusting those upward. There's no question that that's part of any kind of a solution. That is not the only answer, but it is certainly part of what would be necessary to have any kind of a bargain.
It fits.
Sorry?
It fits.
Fits.
That was the question.
It depends what you mean by means testing, though. What we're talking about is charging upper income seniors more for their Medicare, for instance. We already do that in the Part B premium. We would escalate it some. It doesn't mean that high income people shouldn't get benefits at all, which is what some people mean by means testing. And they say, why should Bill Gates get Social Security, whatever? Well, he probably shouldn't, but there aren't enough Bill Gateses to matter. Personally, I think it is important to keep everybody in the system, because you don't know at the beginning whether you're going to make a lot of money or not.
Let's talk, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, the Concord Coalition has been in favor of means testing in the sense of income-relating benefits. That means that, as Alice said, you don't cut everything off, but there should be some greater relationship between benefits and need. If, you know, in a situation like now where we need to cut back the cost. Let me just say on the Medicare thing, I think a lot of people don't realize or don't think about how heavily subsidized that program is. People pay into it through the payroll tax. People who have retired will claim, will sign up for Medicare Part D and Part B and pay a premium for it. And there's a natural tendency to think, well, I'm paying my way, except that the Part B and D, the premiums are designed only to cover 25% of the program's cost. So everybody is getting a 75%, not everybody, because as Alice said, there's some means testing going on now, but most are getting this 75% subsidy. And the question is, does that really make sense when you're trying so desperately to control healthcare costs? And so should that be part of the solution? And so that type of means test is actually a reduction in subsidies. And that same concept really applies to the tax code as well. There was some discussion before about tax entitlements and benefits that are funneled through the tax code. There should be some quote-unquote means testing of those as well.
I want to get to the tax code, but
so I just want to repeat what Senator Ayotte mentioned earlier this morning. Today, the average Medicare recipient will have paid in $119,000 over their lifetime, but will take out of the system well over $300,000 in benefits. That's the dilemma.
well, but some of that also addresses inefficiencies within the healthcare system.
Absolutely.
Right.
So we have a very straightforward question from the audience. What are the major reforms and changes contained in the Bipartisan Policy Center's proposal on healthcare?
Shall I?
Who would like to take it?
They're both experts.
Go ahead.
All right, Bill, Alice?
Alice first.
They are to change, modernize, as we say, the benefit structure in Medicare so that it has a cap on out-of-pocket costs, which it now does not have, and has the same cost sharing and deductibles for Part A and B. That's just a simplification, but it does something important. One of the reasons that we have high health spending is that people buy Medigap insurance to make sure that they don't pay those co-insurance and deductibles themselves, and that they don't pay if they get very high expenditure. We would reduce the incentive to have Medigap insurance, and also say if you buy a Medigap policy, it has to have some deductible and co-insurance, and it can't make it free. That's a minor thing, but it is important. The thing that is most important is changing the structure of incentives and having Medicare pay for value, and gradually collecting the information, as you point out, and change the system in that direction, so that gradually most people are in a Medicare network, which is reimbursed for taking care of them and has an incentive to do it efficiently. We would also change Medicare Advantage and make for competitive bidding among the plans that are in it, so that they compete the cost down.
That's very important.
And then we would, and that's a way of getting competition into the system, not going fully to premium support as actually we have supported in the past, but getting competition in. And finally, one big thing that is really important is changing the tax treatment of employer-paid benefits, so that gradually we lower the amount of health care benefit that can be excluded from your taxable income.
You're illustrating here why entitlement, or whatever we wish to call it, reform,
is complicated.
Cannot be disconnected from tax code
Right,
reform.
right.
Inextricably linked, and I'm glad.
What did I leave out, Bill?
No, you covered it. You covered everything pretty much. The only thing I would emphasize is we do say we're going to maintain fee-for-service. We're basically setting up three delivery systems. If you want to stay in fee-for-service, you can stay in fee-for-service. However, we will make the incentives such that probably most providers will say, I want to move into a coordinated care delivery system, capitated, and that would be the Medicare networks. And if you want to stay in Medicare Advantage, absolutely stay in Medicare. In other words, we're not destroying, we're just refining that. And particularly on the Medicare networks, I want to emphasize the fact that there were obviously some on the Republican side that say we should repeal Obamacare. That's not going to happen. We're going to have to build upon it. And so what Dr. Rivlin and Senator Domenici have done here is build upon the good things in the Obamacare legislation. That is these things called accountable care organizations, which we call Medicare networks, which are fundamentally changed. And I really want to emphasize Alice's last point, which is changing the tax code. As you say, when you get into this whole area of reform, there is no question in my mind that tax reform is inextricably linked to entitlement reform. So many things in that tax code, if it hadn't been for the way the tax code smart staff decided we couldn't get it on the spending side, we'll run it through the tax code. That's where we have to make the change. And that Cadillac tax, which is in there, that doesn't kick in until 2018. I always thought it was 2018 because it would never come into existence. If that stays in effect, we honestly believe that that would destroy employer-sponsored insurance out there in the future, and that's why it's fundamental. So when I said $300 billion earlier, we have to also add the tax code. We also, by making that change, had another 260. So we're talking about a $560 billion 10-year package.
And the second 10 years
Yes.
is $1 trillion savings, 990 billion.
So when President Obama talks about overhauling the tax code, he says billionaires get a tax deduction for their corporate jet, their private jet. Isn't that a shanda, as my father would say in Yiddish? Easy to say. Some of the biggest deductions in the tax code are the home mortgage, the child, the very popular tax credits that millions of Americans hold dear. So when you, as the bipartisan group trying to come up with responsible solutions, take a look at that, do you say, oh, well, that's easy to redline, that's a huge savings? Or do you say, well, people will never buy into that, so we have to leave that as it is? I mean, how do you address these challenges?
Well, there's one thing that we did that also, because I was in, Bill, the four of us were all part of the original Domenici-Rivlin plan. One thing that we did that the Bowles-Simpson Commission also did was to make a trade-off to say that we're going to either greatly scale back or eliminate these tax expenditures. And with that new revenue, then what could you do? And you could, the trade-off would be that you would lower rates to make a more efficient, fairer, less complicated tax code, and you would use some of the additional revenue to reduce the deficit. So, you know, we settled at two rates of 28 and 15%. Bowles-Simpson was about the same, but that's one of the trade-offs that you can make. If you can make the carrot for eliminating some of these cherished deductions is that you get a lower rate, and that was something that we found on our commission, and I think this might play out in Congress as well, and is that Republicans were willing to accept higher revenues if it came with lower rates. So you got a more efficient tax code, but it would bring in more revenue.
But boy, I feel like anybody who, I mean, I don't want to loop back into the politics of it too deeply, but anybody who wants to run as a populist, you're just handing them a big bludgeon, right?
Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily. This one, you have something tangible to give them. You're going to cut their rates.
Cut the rates.
And also
both corporate and non-corporate gets the rates reduced.
Corporate and non-corporate rates go down.
Can I just make one observation that we heard it earlier this morning that House Republicans, and I'm wearing a purple tie to be bipartisan here, House Republicans say, no way, Jose, no more revenues. So our friend Chairman Ryan passes a House budget resolution that has the same level of revenues that's in, to Dave, I'm sorry, the baseline, doesn't change. It puts this big bird on automatic pilot, keeps the same level of revenues. And then in his budget he says, I want to reduce the corporate tax rate, I want to cut back on the individual tax rates, I want to reduce all this. If we take what he says he wants to do, the Tax Institute has estimated that over 10 years is $6 trillion in reduction in tax revenue. But I want to keep, wait a minute, how do you do that? I want to keep the total revenues the same. There's only one way you can do that. You have to go back to the tax exclusions, deductions, credits, and that's $1 trillion a year, but you left out the most important tax exclusion, and that was employer-provided health insurance. That's larger than anything else.
But in the various budget proposals, none of those are specified.
No, well, that's depends which budget proposals you're talking about. They were very well specified in Domenici, Rivlin, and in Simpson Bowles. And
well, the ones put forth by people who are elected.
Well, but I wanted to come back to your early point. There's nothing to give to people you're just attacking. Take, for instance, what we did in our Bipartisan Policy Center proposal, which was basically blow up the tax code and start over. But we did restore some special provisions. One is for home mortgages. Now, you might argue that you shouldn't do that, but we think that's important.
Why?
But we change. Well, the rationale is it's good to favor home ownership. Now, that's a whole other discussion.
Sure.
But if you buy that, we've always done that. We changed the deduction to a credit. And since, as Bob said, we had two rates of 15 and 28, we made this a credit at the lower rate. You'd get 15% off your mortgage up to a limit, no matter what it was. And you wouldn't have to itemize to get that. So think about it. That makes it much more valuable to people in the lower and middle income ranges who own houses, and to people who don't now itemize, who don't even take the deduction. And so a lot more people benefit from this. Now, the people who would not benefit would be upper income people with very high mortgages. But we just had an experience with a lot of big mortgages for upper income people. Now, you'd have to phase it in, but it makes a much more sensible way of aiding home ownership through the tax code than the one we do now, which gives differential amounts to richer people with bigger houses.
Senator Domenici, you wanted to jump in?
No, that's exactly right. And we take each one of the expenditures and we look at them and we treat them and deal with them. And there's a rationale, and the one on home ownership is, as Alice explained it. I want everybody to understand that this has been done before. So it's not like we're undertaking a world-changing, never-has-been-done episode. When Bob Packwood was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, whatever.
1986.
86.
The theory and the idea were put into play, and believe it or not, without this problem of a huge deficit and not significant steady growth, he did accomplish a simplified one under Reagan administration. And the Senate voted for that with reduction changes, took them out, made it much more simple.
I asked how the White House is responding to these proposals. Has anyone taken them to Republican leadership?
Yes.
And?
Bill has.
Senate Republican leadership or House Republican leadership?
Both. Either. Who have you spoken to?
We've spoken to both sides and Democrats, and generally the response has been this is at least on the health care proposal here, this is well thought out. I'm not casting dispersions on the commission that Dr. Rivlin served on, but unlike Bowles-Simpson, this is specific. This is aggregated. The problem with budgeteers is we have these catalog lists, pick and choose. This is not a pick and choose. This is a unified proposal to move forward and put it together in one. Not to say they have to adopt. Been very positively received. Obviously, there's still a strong feeling in the House Republican leadership staff in the House that you didn't repeal Obamacare.
Really? I mean, when you're meeting with them behind closed doors, having a conversation about this.
And you didn't do anything with Medicaid. And we made that very explicit decision with what's going on with Medicaid. This was not the time to get involved in Medicaid, and the most difficult of difficult issues they had to deal with was something called the dual eligibles, the low-income elderly Medicare, Medicaid recipients, and that's very difficult.
I have to say, when you tell me that closed-door meetings with senior staffers in the House Republican caucus, that they are saying, well, you didn't put repeal Obamacare in this proposal, to me that says they're not realistic. They're not actually trying to solve the problem.
It's called ideology.
But that's supposed to be for when you're making speeches on the floor. It's not when you're having a meeting with people who are actually...
One would assume they're representing their members.
Well, we have to wait and see what happens when their membership is tough to with everything in front of them.
Yeah.
Back to taxes.
Back to taxes.
Bill's right that our health proposal is more specific than Simpson-Bowles was. But I think it's encouraging that the tax proposals are very similar, and that Republicans in the Senate anyway did vote for Simpson-Bowles as well as Democrats. That Tom Coburn, my perhaps all-time favorite Republican, did say when he signed it, he said, there's a lot in this I don't like, but I've figured out that if we're going to solve this problem, Tom Coburn isn't going to get everything he wants. And that's the spirit that has to be there if we're to reform the tax code or the health system or anything else.
So somebody walk me through how this grand bargain takes shape. Does Domenici Rivlin go to McCain Schumer, which then gets passed by the Senate and goes to, like, how does this all happen?
I have a theory. It's only that. We are getting back to regular order a little bit. The House has passed a budget blueprint. The Senate has passed a budget blueprint. Now, it was a little pushed by the fact that they were not going to get paid on April the 15th if they didn't pass budgets. And my only thought was they should have said, and you don't get paid unless you have a conference agreement. But now we have a House and we have a Senate. I think the thing to watch in the coming weeks, will they appoint conferees? Will they go to conference? If they go to conference, then the president's budget comes into this discussion, and as Alice said, that's kind of down the middle. And if there's a desire to produce a blueprint, the normal process, then all the elements are there between the House passed and the Senate passed to come to the middle. That, to me, is the way an agreement would come about. I am personally, I'm an old regular order guy. I appreciate what Senator McCain and others have done with these various gangs of 6 and gangs of 20 and gangs of 30. But to me, it's the process that involves everybody, and that's the regular process of passing a budget, conferencing a budget, implementing that budget through the normal reconciliation.
Senator Domenici, do you agree?
Well, look, I've been working on the budget under the Budget Act since it was passed. And these budget resolutions are the creatures, statutory creatures that are created by the Budget Act. And I must say, Bill Hoagland is both the Senate and House expert, most expert on the Budget Act and its implementation. And so it's pretty obvious to me that he would be rather gung-ho when he thinks about doing this under the Budget Act in the regular order. But I think there's so many problems with the regular order, with the resolutions, and I'm not sure they're necessary, because they do mean something, but they mean an awful lot less than people think. The resolutions are very vague, they're not enforceable. I think the way this comes about is much the way our friend Graham, Rudman, and Hollings produced their change to the Budget Act in that heralded piece of legislation, which everybody should know was done on the floor of the Senate, not in committee, but as an amendment. This very huge bill that had sequester in it, described what a sequester was. You know, nobody in the Congress had ever had the word sequester. You had to go to the dictionary and see what does this mean? And then there's a word in there, reconciliation. And we all know what reconciliation is. If you're a Catholic, it means go to confession. If it's others, it means something else. But the truth of the matter is, nobody knew what reconciliation meant. So we decided we would give it a meaning, and it's commonly known as the Domenici reconciliation, and we know how to use that. But it's kind of a difficult thing, but it'll be used. My answer is, if the President of the United States, sometime in the next 3 months, is convinced by those who are close to him that this is necessary for our people, and if he believes that, and for you, Mr. President, you must take the lead or we will flop. If that happens, then I see various ways that it can be done, and it does not have to. It can be putting it together and getting groups to support it, and then offering it on some other bill as a big giant amendment. That could be done. That seems to me to be more likely than the other way.
Did you want to jump in?
Well, I think the theme of both panels has been the president's got to get engaged and broker a deal. And the question is, how far do you go with the regular order? Do you go, I'm encouraged also that the Congress is getting back to work. And there are a couple of paths. The one that Bill describes is one where the budget committees come together and then they get the president's budget into the mix. But the Senate is key as well. And the other one that you described, I think, is possible. A grand bargain emerges in the Senate. The president works with them. It passes the Senate by a large enough majority that the House is impressed. And then you try to get it through the House.
I think it is important to try to follow the regular order, but be working on something irregular as well, so that you've got because I think the irregular process can make the regular order work. If they're working behind the scenes to come to some sort of compromise, the thing that is sort of hovering over all of this that was alluded to in the first panel is the debt ceiling. If left to their own devices, I don't know that the members would really want to go through the hard choices here for the sake of it. But there is an action-forcing event. And even though it's a dysfunctional, stupid sort of thing, a nominal debt limit is, not a really good idea. But there it is. It's an action-forcing event. And so, perhaps it's a dysfunctional gimmick to to address a dysfunctional problem. They're going to have to do something by the end of August or somewhere towards the fall to address a debt limit. So that provides the impetus to come together either through regular order or something that's going on behind the scenes.
Let me pose a specific policy question from the audience that goes back a bit in our conversation. When you reduce the interest deduction nationwide, you greatly disadvantage, I think we were talking about the home mortgage deduction, you greatly disadvantage those who live in cities like Boston, New York, et cetera, where housing costs often are huge. How can you sell this if there isn't a locality adjustment?
I don't have the answer.
Anyone? Aside from the fact that Boston and New York have disproportionately little representation in Congress relative to more rural areas?
But then that's right.
I think it's a problem. I'm not sure it's a fixable problem. If you start doing locality adjustments on all kinds of things, the health costs are different in different parts of the country, and housing costs are different in different parts of the country, but so are incomes. It's a never-ending mess.
Well, I would agree with that in its entirety. And I would think that this gives me a chance to say something about that hasn't been asked that is very important. One of you should ask the question, if things are so bad fiscally, why are interest rates so low?
A very good question.
A very good question.
What's the answer?
Well, the answer is that it does not mean that we have no fiscal problems. That this debt we've been telling you about and the extraordinary high ratio, which only occurred one time in our history, which was the Second World War, when we took off all limits and said, win the war. Well, then we went up and away with the expenditures. But as soon as that war was over, they brought it down, and all the purchasers of the bonds were Americans, not foreign countries. So we never did that again. But now we're in a situation where the world is looking at us, and they're saying it's still the best venue to put our money.
Is that just because everyone else is so much worse?
That's because the other ones are worse and more fearful. And look, if you had a pot of money in one of these countries you've been hearing about, and somebody was looking with your finance man and said, where do you put this $1 million? And they ticked it off. Most of them in their broken English would say, American dollar.
So we should be thankful that Europe is an economic disaster.
We should be thankful that the dollar is a powerful thing. That's what we should be thankful.
One of our former colleagues, or Alice's former colleagues, Rudy Penner, likes to say we're the best looking horse in the glue factory today. But while I'm at it, and since Alan Simpson's name, Senator Simpson, some of you, and I think some of you have heard this, Alan Simpson likes to point out that we have a treaty with Taiwan. And that treaty with Taiwan says that should China to go to war to take back Taiwan, we would have to go to war with China. Today, we'd have to borrow from China to go to war with China. What Senator says, after World War II, obviously, we had 100% of debt to GDP, but we owed it to ourselves, and that's the problem today. Since about 50%, 60% when I looked at it last day, I don't know where we are today, is not owned by Americans, and thank God they're investing in us. But we still. But I want to come back to a point that Mr. Walker made this morning. When I looked at the numbers, and these are not made-up numbers, these are the current baseline projections, between if the economy recovers and those T-bill rates that are historically low right now return to normal rates 5%. In the period between 2015 and 2020, the fastest growing component of the federal budget will just be paying the interest on that debt, and the annual rate of increase in interest payments will be close to 19%.
Wow.
Okay, so this ties right into a question from the audience. Do you think that this problem will not get solved until the rest of the world stops buying our debt? Will that precipitate the crisis that will finally lead to change? I mean, will that ever happen?
I don't know.
I mean,
I don't know who
we have to
asked
We
hope
don't-
not. We have to
We
pray
don't know.
not.
We don't want to find out.
We don't want to find out.
I
That's
think
the
that
point, yeah.
the answer to that is, we don't know, but we don't want to find out.
Yeah.
But I can tell you, it's so extraordinary that I don't think it's around forever. It's going to change sometime.
What's so extraordinary, you mean, is that interest rates are so low and people
Yeah.
are still buying
That's
American
right.
dollars despite.
And it sticks there. It's pretty low, and it's holding low.
Yeah.
This is a huge risk, I mean, because we're taking on a huge amount of debt, which is, when it gets rolled over at higher rates at some point, is going to be much, much more expensive. And as Bill points out, just under a quote-unquote baseline or do-nothing scenario, the projections are for interest payments on the debt to go from around $200 billion now to around $900 billion just within 10 years. So, I mean, and it really does become, it's like trying to live off your credit card by paying the minimum amount. And if there were, for some reason, to be an interest rate spike, and that just assumes the 10-year bond goes back to about 5.5%, 5.2%. If it goes to 6 or 7 or something like that, which could happen, the interest costs are much, much higher. So that really is a ticking time bomb, which has nothing to do with the demographics. That's an addition to the structural deficits.
Right.
And it's a reason for trying to take action sooner rather than later, not instant austerity or anything like that, but you can't just let this thing go because the interest costs just balloon.
I
That's a very good point.
just wanted to, for the young students and the young lawyers starting out, I just want to remind, as it relates to Graham, Rudman, Hollings, the whole raison d'etre for Graham, Rudman, Hollings was raising the statutory debt limit to $2 trillion. We are now at $17 trillion. And it wasn't that long ago. I think he was right then, and he would be right today that this is a problem.
Somebody in the audience asks, changing and simplifying the tax code is all very well, but what about incentivizing healthcare providers towards efficiency and results? For example, the $1.50 per Tylenol issue, this sounds like what's contained in your proposal.
That's
right.
what we're trying to do.
I think that since I wasn't on their healthcare task force, that's what I was going to say. Is that I think that is what they're trying to do. And the good news is that I think that there's a lot of agreement between healthcare economists and politicians that is the direction that we need to go. I mean, the Simpson-Bowles proposal, they had a new one last week that was a little bit more detailed than their original. There's still some details to be worked out, but they were trying to go in that same direction and had a lot of good things to say about Alice and Pete's proposal.
What's the value of having different competing proposals, Simpson-Bowles, Domenici, Rivlin, various outside frameworks? Is it just a buffet to choose from if you're a lawmaker?
Yes, I think so. There are other groups working on the healthcare problem. The Engelberg Center at the Brookings Institution is about to come out with a report which has a lot of very qualified people working on it. And the direction of the proposals are the same. I think when you get a lot of people thinking about it in different rooms and different places, and they come out with similar proposals, it's reassuring to lawmakers that they're not going off the deep end somewhere.
And
I think that's the answer to your question, is why you have them. Because if they're done by groups or institutions that have credibility, and you've got two of them, it's a lot better than just having one. You know, I remember harking back to the federal government and the making of nuclear bombs. We had Los Alamos was the historic place they did it, and then they wondered, and big thinkers wondered if their secrets were being stolen. How will you find out? So what they do, they went to another place far, far away and built a whole new lab, just like the other one. And then they believed the two labs where they weren't sure about one. That's a different kind of approach, but that's what the lawmakers did and what the thinkers did then. And ours, they'll be looking at ours, they'll be looking at Simpson's, and then find areas of commonality, some areas where they differ, and they learn from it. And the two is better than one.
we've talked about the healthcare costs piece, we've talked about the retirees piece, we've talked about the overhauling the tax code piece. What are the other major pieces of this sort of grand bargain that have to be wrestled with?
Those are the main ones.
Yeah, if you don't do those two, you don't get, you've got the tax rate increase from the fiscal cliff deal and discretionary spending cuts, caps came from the Budget Control Act on the last one. And, you know, between those, there's been some progress made, but as I think we've all agreed that the things that haven't been tackled are the fundamental tax reform and healthcare pieces, and if you don't do that, you're really not serious about getting the debt under control over the long term. We haven't talked specifically about Social Security, if you wanted to tiptoe into that area.
Shall we?
Well, before we do, we ought to mention one thing that we were just talking about. You know, it isn't going to do very much good to get all this reform if we don't get growth. And if the pie from which the American people stick their straw and get what sustenance they are entitled to or earn out of the American economy, if that doesn't get bigger, as more straws have to get food from it, you have big problems.
Well,
and right now we've got a whole bunch of unemployed that aren't yet participating in that pie.
Right.
And we got to fix the extreme growth part of this budget. But in doing it, if we aren't taking the right steps so that you come out with a potentially, we don't know exactly what makes things grow, but we do know too much debt to most of our people means that much of the sustenance is going to the debt instead of to the normal growth. A very logical thing that people ought to understand. That's what's happening.
And so whenever President Obama talks about debt and deficit reduction, he also talks about funding infrastructure and teachers and other things that he says will be stimulative measures, to which Republicans, as we heard Senator Graham in the previous panel, say, no way, absolutely not, non-starter. Bill?
Well, the biggest stimulus package that we could do right now, and I fought with appropriators. I've done everything I can to hold down on domestic discretionary and defense spending over our careers on the Hill. But the biggest stimulus we could have right now is to take that damn sequester off and replace it with changes in the consumption-oriented entitlement programs. And I'm sorry, I disagree with Senator Graham. We are moving the level of investment in education, science, technology. If we stay on the path we're on, we will be at a 40-year low as a share of the national economy investing in that sector of the economy. We're not. That is really scary to me. That's infrastructure, that's education, that's science, that's technology.
My understanding is that the sequester actually grows the debt because it forces the Pentagon to renege on previously negotiated contracts that they then have to renegotiate at less favorable rates.
Probably a lot of those. There's another one where I wonder where the president got his expertise. He took the airways and for about 2 weeks was telling everyone that the sequester was not going to hurt anybody. Then he had to change it. He's been on both sides of it. No,
I don't remember him saying it wasn't going to hurt anybody. I heard a lot of briefings with a lot of cabinet officials saying...
I'm wrong.
I think he exaggerated the immediate effect, but not the long-term effect. Exactly. We're beginning to see the long-term effect. I think the important thing about the discretionary spending is that both defense and domestic, we can spend federal dollars better, and we've got to examine federal programs, including defense, and see if we can spend the money more effectively. But the sequester is a really stupid way to go at that problem.
Well, but that was the point of it, right?
Yeah, that was the point of it.
It was never going to happen because it was so stupid and nobody wanted it.
So that's what we should do, what Senator Domenici just said.
So I have to say, you know, when I should say while she's here, but I sort of did, when Senator Ayotte says, oh, well, the debt ceiling will force us to finally get this deal, well, the sequester was supposed to force everybody to finally get this deal.
Yes.
The sequester was supposed to be so unpalatable.
It didn't.
And
they are different. They are different. The sequester is mindless across-the-board cuts, but they're not. They wouldn't have the catastrophic consequences, the potential catastrophic consequences of simply ignoring of defaulting on
Which was actually the
obligations
reason the
on the debt.
Republicans reordered them. Originally, the debt ceiling was supposed to come first. They bumped it back so it would come last in this sequence of parade of horribles, as they say.
But the basic point is it's a dumb way to run a country.
Both are dumb ways. Yeah.
Both are dumb ways to run a country, and we should be focusing on how do we solve this big problem, which is nobody's fault. I mean, we don't, the health care and the aging of the population.
Both want to jump in.
Yeah, I just want to say that the best thing we can do for growth is to repeal the tax code and put in a growth-oriented tax code.
That's true too.
There's just nobody who will argue with that.
Yeah.
You need to lower the rates. That's the biggest incentive we know about that will work.
Senator Rudman and Senator Graham always referred to the sequester as the sort of Damocles coming down, and that it would never happen. And it didn't, quite frankly. I was wonder how Senator Rudman would feel today to know that we after almost 28 years, the sort of Damocles did come down. But I want to go back. We never answered your earlier question about other entitlements. I agree. The three are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But let's be honest, and it rolls off the tongue so easily, entitlement reform. But there are other areas, and they're not.
They're growing too.
I'm a farm boy from Indiana. I agree with Senator McCain. There is a farm bill that we should remove those subsidies with much trepidation. I also raised TRICARE and federal pensions reforms. There are a number of other areas, and then with real trepidation, I think, and I ran for a few years the federal food stamp program. We've got some problems. But when you talk about safety net programs, oh my gosh, you're going to get in trouble. But I think there's some real issues in our safety net entitlement programs that need to be addressed also.
So if any elected officials feel that taking on seniors is too easy a lift, they can try veterans and food stamp recipients.
Yes.
Well, there's something that Senator Graham said that's true. The bigger the deal, the easier it is to get done, actually. If you try to do a small deal, you're going to narrow it, and you really bring the special interest. So if everybody gets the sense that everybody has given something and everything was on the table, that can be easier to accomplish.
If I have any complaints, and we worked on it, we worked with them, we helped draft Graham, Rudman, Hollings. If I have any complaint, it is the fact that we left 2/3 out of the federal budget in that sequester. Had we left in, which I think it passed the Senate with Social Security in there and Medicaid, had we kept that plus the safety net programs, I think we'd be having a much different discussion today about the sequester than we're having right now.
Now, I was not part of these conversations in Senator Rudman's time, but just from the film last night, I get the sense that he was very passionate about the growing debts and deficits that this country has to wrestle with and the growing partisanship and gridlock in Washington. So here we are all these years later, having the same conversations with what sounds to me like the same level of urgency. Why should the outcome be any different this time?
Well, the outcome was different.
Well, it was different, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think when one forgets that we did balance the budget, we can solve problems in this country when we put our mind to it.
That's a very good point. So what do we learn from the few years that we did have a balanced budget?
Well, also, let's remember that the sequester never really kicked in, but boy, it came close in 1989, 1990. We were faced with nearly a 40% across the board reduction, maybe early 87, with in defense and non-defense, and it's deja vu. And President Reagan said, "You're not going to cut defense. You're not going to cut defense," and that brought him to the table. And the Democrats in control of the Congress said, "We have to have revenues." And out of that, and had it not been for the crash, Black Friday, which is the other way we get decisions made in that darn town, is a crisis.
Well, that's the other odd thing. The stock market keeps going up and up and up through crisis after crisis after crisis. Like, don't they know Congress needs the stock market to crash to spur lawmakers into action?
What's it doing today?
What's going on?
Well, there's no sense of sacrifice on Wall Street, I guess.
Don't follow the Wall Street. They're not necessarily the signal. They don't give the signals for the fiscal policy.
All right, well, I want to end.
They run on their own.
I want to wrap up with David Walker kindly sends in the same question that I put to the previous panel to wrap up with. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being it'll never happen, 10 being absolutely, what's the likelihood that there will be a meaningful grand bargain this year, and what is essential to make it happen? Let's go down the line.
A meaningful grand bargain. There's some qualifiers in there. Any bargain would be grand. I don't know if it would be meaningful. I would say that there's about a 4 that there'd be a meaningful grand bargain, about a 7 on some sort of thing to get over the debt limit.
Well, that's funny to me because everyone keeps saying a big deal is easier than a small one.
I know, but they don't seem prepared to want to do that.
Let's hope it's a 10 to get over the debt limit, because if we don't get through the debt ceiling, then the whole country
they'll do
is just
something
sort
to
of
get over the debt limit,
right.
but I mean something. I'd say on what I would consider a meaningful grand bargain 4.
And what's necessary to get it done?
Oh, you
What
got
are
to
the
do some of
essential-
you got to do a lot of the healthcare reforms that Alice and Pete were talking about, and you have to get revenues. And the only way to get revenues in this environment, you can't raise rates, is to do some of the loophole closings, tax expenditure reform that we were talking about. There's no point going back to the other parts of the budget.
Well, you answered this question on the previous panel.
I'm committed to a 7 on a meaningful grand bargain, and let me answer the what does it take question in a process sense. It takes the president getting engaged. It takes bipartisanship in the Senate, and I think it may take Speaker Boehner being willing to waive the Hastert rule one more time.
Well, it's very difficult, but I'll go with the positive side by 2 points, so I'll take 7. But I say that's dependent on one thing happening, and that's that the President of the United States finds it within his thoughtfulness about his country that this has to be done, and that somebody sells him on that, and he lets the American people know that, then I think there's a real chance all this work has been good because we can put the pieces together. Whereas if we were starting from scratch, it'd be a long, long time getting something that was meaningful. So I think presidential overt decision that he wants to get it done, and there's an opportunity to get a grand bargain before we get out.
Bill?
Yeah, and I'm being very bipartisan right down the middle. I'll say a 5. And I'll say that what's necessary to get it done, it's already been stated a couple of times. It will require leadership. It requires leadership from the President of the United States engaging. And also, and Dr. Rivlin's already touched on it, it really is going to require Speaker Boehner to step forward and unpledge the pledge that revenues can't be on the table, because there's no way on God's green earth that Republicans are going to agree to revenue increases unless there's, and again, this runs off the tongue so nicely, fundamental reforms in entitlement programs. And finally, it's going to require, at the end of the day, that sequester is waived and replaced with more structural changes in the budget.
Before we break for lunch, I just want to ask one more question about timing, which is that we've talked a lot about the debt limit as sort of the trigger. You know, Congress can bump that back by a week, a month, 6 months. At some point, the midterm pressures overwhelm the ability to pass something like this. What is the time frame that this has to get done before the midterms take over?
I think it's this year. And I don't think anybody wants another debt ceiling crisis. So that, as you say, could be postponed if it looks like there's progress.
But there has to be a sign of progress.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Everybody agrees this year?
Oh, yeah. September.
Billy, that's
October.
Do I hear November?
September means October, knowing Congress is December 31st at midnight.
Might be.
Bill has he doesn't.
No, I'm okay.
Not sure
May
of that.
18th, we reach the statutory debt limit that we think can be stretched out, Bob, to the end of July. Deja vu. They got a few other things on their agenda, like immigration reform. So I would say it's going to be tough, but I would say it has to be done this fall.
All right. Thanks to all 4 of you. This has been such an interesting